My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words that sound kind but feel small, quiet, sensitive, a little scattered, emotional. The kind of woman people assume needs protection from her own thoughts. I work in a role that doesn't attract attention. Nothing flashy, nothing that invites applause. I'm dependable, I show up, and I listen more than I speak. And because of that, people often decide who I am before I ever open my mouth. They think they know my limits. They think they know my story. This is not a story about revenge. It's not about winning an argument, humiliating anyone, or proving that I was secretly smarter all along. It's about what happens when lies are repeated so often, they start to feel like facts. And what happens when someone finally asks for those lies to be explained calmly, out loud, in front of everyone. The moment happened at a Thanksgiving dinner, a long table, familiar faces. The kind of gathering where old roles are quietly enforced without discussion, where family dynamics don't need to be announced because everyone already knows where they sit. By that point, my siblings had been telling people I was not well for years, not in dramatic ways, not cruelly, just enough. Eleanor exaggerates. Eleanor remembers things wrong. Eleanor's a bit unstable, you know how she is. They said it casually, with smiles, with concern in their voices, and because they said it calmly, others accepted it. I accepted it too, for longer than I should have. This story is not about a single sentence that changed everything. It's about a long accumulation of small dismissals, polite invalidations, and quiet decisions I made when no one was watching. It's about restraint, about patience, about the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. And yes, it's about the night I finally asked them to explain. Not angrily, not dramatically, just clearly, slowly, in front of everyone who had ever believed them without question. What followed wasn't chaos, it was silent. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through how that silence was built, piece by piece, long before that dinner ever happened. I'll share what it feels like to be underestimated by the people closest to you, and what it takes to step out of a role you never agreed to play. I'm telling this story honestly, without exaggeration, without decorating the truth to make myself look stronger than I was. Because this isn't about dominance through force, it's about dominance through clarity. Before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently. Have you ever noticed how easily someone's version of you can become louder than your own? To understand what happened that Thanksgiving, you need to understand who I was to them long before that night. In my family, identity wasn't something you chose. It was assigned early, then reinforced quietly until it felt permanent. My older brother was the reliable one, practical, grounded, the person everyone trusted with logistics and money. My younger sister was the expressive one, emotional, creative, big-hearted, which also meant she was forgiven for saying things the rest of us wouldn't dare. And then there was I. I was the sensitive one. That word followed me everywhere. It sounded gentle, even affectionate, but it carried an unspoken translation. Eleanor can't be fully trusted with reality. If I was hurt, it was because I took things too personally. If I disagreed, it was because I misunderstood. If I remembered something differently, it was because my emotions distorted the facts. No one ever said I was stupid. They didn't need to. At family gatherings, I was often physically present, but conversationally absent. When discussions turned serious, finances, decisions, plans, my role was to listen, nod, and eventually help clean up. If I offered an opinion, it was met with a pause that felt polite on the surface, but final underneath. Eleanor worries too much. She reads into things. She means well. Those phrases became a kind of soft barrier. They sounded caring, but they kept me outside the circle where reality was negotiated. What's important is this. I didn't fight it, not because I agreed with them, but because fighting would have confirmed the role they'd already written for me. Any pushback would be proof that I was, in fact, difficult, emotional, unstable. So I learned how to be agreeable in a way that didn't feel like lying. I listened carefully. I asked clarifying questions instead of challenging statements. I smiled when stories about my overreactions were retold as family jokes. People think invisibility looks like neglect. Sometimes it looks like inclusion without authority. I was invited to everything: holidays, birthdays, group chats. But my presence was symbolic, not influential. I was there to absorb, not to shape. And over time, something subtle happened. My siblings didn't just speak about me, they began to speak for me. If someone asked why I wasn't dating seriously, my sister would laugh and say, "Eleanor is just in her head a lot." If a relative asked about my job, my brother would explain it in simplified terms, as if translating something complex into safer language. I noticed, but I didn't correct them. Because correcting someone who believes they're protecting you is a dangerous thing. It makes you look ungrateful, defensive, confused about your own limitations. So instead, I observed. I watched how easily concern could be used as control, how tone mattered more than accuracy, how calmly stated assumptions were rarely questioned, especially when they painted the speaker as reasonable and the subject as fragile. I also noticed something else. No one ever asked me to explain myself. They asked each other. They compared notes, they reached conclusions. And slowly, without any announcement, my credibility eroded. This wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was erosion, grain by grain. A story told often enough that it stopped sounding like a story and started sounding like a diagnosis. The strange part is that I remained calm throughout all of it. I wasn't seething, I wasn't plotting, I wasn't even particularly angry. I was paying attention. Because when people underestimate you, they stop guarding their words. They explain their reasoning out loud. They repeat themselves, they reveal patterns. And when no one believes you're capable of strategy, you're given something rare: time. At that stage, I didn't yet know what I would do with that time. I only knew one thing for certain. The version of me being passed around that family table did not match the woman quietly taking notes in her mind. And eventually, those two versions would have to meet. The first moment I can clearly identify, I didn't feel important at the time. That's what makes it dangerous. Small cuts rarely announce themselves as injuries. They present as misunderstandings, jokes, or practical decisions made for your own good. It happened years before that Thanksgiving dinner, at a family brunch. Nothing formal, just coffee, plates passed around, sunlight coming in through the kitchen window. The kind of morning that's meant to feel safe. My brother was talking about an investment opportunity he was considering. Real estate, numbers, projections, timelines. Everyone leaned in slightly, listening with interest. I listened too. Not because I wanted to challenge him, but because I had something relevant to add. At the time, I just completed a financial literacy course through work. Budget modeling, risk assessment. Nothing dramatic, just skills I'd worked hard to learn. When there was a pause, I said calmly, "Have you accounted for maintenance volatility? The first 2 years usually look stable, but..." He smiled, a small one, not unkind. "Oh, Ellie," he said, gently interrupting. "This stuff gets complicated fast. Let's not stress you out." There it was. No raised voice, no insult. Just a decision made on my behalf, that the information was too much for me, that my nervous system couldn't handle complexity, that my contribution wasn't just unnecessary but potentially harmful to me. My sister laughed softly, not at me, at the situation, as if my comment were endearing but misplaced, like a child chiming in at an adult table. No one objected. No one corrected him. The conversation simply moved on. Without me. I nodded, took a sip of coffee, let the moment pass. Outwardly, nothing happened. But inside, something registered very clearly. My competence had been quietly dismissed in front of witnesses. And because it was framed as care, there was no socially acceptable way to object without appearing defensive. If I'd said, "I can handle it," it would have sounded like I was proving his point. If I'd insisted, I would have been emotional, difficult. So I stayed silent. That's the part people misunderstand. Silence isn't always submission. Sometimes it's the only option that preserves your long-term credibility, even if it costs you something in the moment. What stayed with me wasn't embarrassment, it was information. I noticed how easily a narrative could be reinforced by tone alone, how quickly others accepted a version of me that required no evidence, just repetition and confidence. I noticed that my brother hadn't actually refuted my point. He hadn't needed to. He'd simply decided I wasn't a valid source. That was the cut. Small, clean, almost polite. And like all small cuts, it was easy for everyone else to forget. By the time brunch ended, the plates were cleared, the topic had changed, and no one remembered what I'd said, or that I'd been dismissed at all. But I remembered. Not in a dramatic way. I didn't replay it obsessively. I didn't confront anyone later. I just added it to a growing internal record, one I didn't yet know the purpose of. Over the next few months, similar moments appeared. Comments phrased as protection. Decisions were made in my absence because it would be too much for Eleanor. Stories retold with gentle concern that subtly edited out my agency. Each instance alone was easy to excuse. Together, they formed a pattern. And patterns matter, because once you see a pattern, you can stop asking why this happens and start asking how this system works. That brunch wasn't the beginning of cruelty. It was the beginning of normalization. From that point on, being spoken over didn't feel shocking. It felt expected. Being excluded didn't feel malicious. It felt efficient. The family had found a way to keep things smooth by keeping me small. And the most dangerous part? I was helping them do it by staying calm, reasonable, and quiet. At the time, I believed restraint was the same as maturity, that being patient would eventually correct the misunderstanding. I hadn't yet learned that when a lie is allowed to live comfortably, it grows roots. And roots are harder to remove than words. After that brunch, nothing dramatically worsened. That's important to understand. There was no sudden cruelty, no obvious escalation. What changed was something quieter, frequency. The dismissals became more regular, more efficient, almost routine. They slipped into conversations the way habits do, unnoticed because they didn't disrupt anything. If I questioned a detail in a story, I was told I remembered it wrong, kindly, patiently. If I expressed discomfort with a plan, I was reassured that I was overthinking. If I set a boundary, it was reframed as anxiety rather than intention. And every time the tone was calm, that calmness did something insidious. It made resistance feel inappropriate. How do you argue with someone who sounds reasonable? How do you defend yourself against concern? I started doing the math in my head before speaking. Is this worth it? Will correcting this change anything? Will I just look emotional again? Most of the time the answer was no. So I adapted. I learned which topics were safe and which ones would trigger gentle dismissal. I stopped volunteering opinions unless I was directly asked. I began to preface statements with disclaimers. I might be wrong, but hoping that humility would make my words easier to accept. It didn't. What it did was confirm the role I'd been assigned. The more cautious I became, the more fragile I appeared. The more careful my language, the less authority it carried. And still I told myself I was choosing peace. This is where self-deception comes in. Not the dramatic kind, but the practical kind. The kind that helps you function inside a system that doesn't quite respect you. I told myself my siblings didn't mean harm, that they were stressed. Families fall into patterns without realizing it. That being the calm one was a strength. And all of that was partially true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The full truth was that my silence was being interpreted as confirmation. Every time I let a mischaracterization slide, it solidified. Every time I didn't correct a false assumption, it became part of the shared story. Eventually, other people began to mirror it. Extended family, family friends. Even strangers, after a few minutes of listening to my siblings talk about me, would tilt their heads with sympathy and say things like, "That must be hard for you," without ever asking what that was. I became an idea more than a person. And ideas are easier to manage. The most unsettling part wasn't that I was being misunderstood. It was that I was being interpreted, constantly, without the right of reply. My emotions, my motives, even my memories were explained away in my presence as if I weren't there. And I let it happen, not because I believed them, but because challenging a collective narrative feels like stepping into moving traffic. You don't just face one person, you face the comfort of everyone else. So I chose invisibility over conflict. I told myself that I didn't need validation from them, that I knew who I was, that eventually consistency would speak louder than corrections. But consistency only works when people are listening. What I didn't yet understand was that my siblings weren't malicious. They were conveniently certain. And certainty, once shared, becomes a social bond. Questioning it would have required them to question themselves. And people rarely do that unless they have to. Still, I stayed quiet. I took notes, not literally at first, but mentally. I observed how stories changed slightly with each retelling, how concerns were exaggerated just enough to sound responsible, how my calm reactions were used as evidence that I was managing, while any frustration would have been labeled as instability. I was trapped in a paradox, too calm to be taken seriously, too emotional if I objected, and so disrespect became normalized, not as cruelty, but as routine. It didn't bruise, it didn't break anything. It just slowly shifted my position in the family from equal adult to someone to be handled. At that stage, I still believed the situation could self-correct, that if I stayed reasonable long enough, the truth would surface on its own. I hadn't yet realized that lies don't collapse under time. They collapse under questions, and I wasn't asking in yet. The realization did not come as a shock. It arrived the way clarity often does. Quietly, almost politely, once you stop defending yourself long enough to observe the system you're inside. I wasn't the problem in my family, I was the solution. Just not in the way that benefited me. My role was to be reliable without being influential, helpful without being authoritative, present without being central. I was the person who remembered birthdays, coordinated schedules when things got tense, and smoothed conversations when emotions rose. I absorbed discomfort so others didn't have to. And in return, I was spared confrontation, which I had mistaken for respect. I began to see how often I was positioned as support rather than participant. When plans were made, I was informed after decisions were finalized. When conflicts arose, I was consulted privately to help interpret or soften someone else's feelings, never to state my own. "You're so good at seeing both sides," my sister would say, which really meant, "Please don't pick one." My brother trusted me to keep secrets, to manage logistics quietly, to step in when something needed fixing without recognition. He valued my steadiness, but not my authority, and I allowed it. Because being useful feels safer than being seen. Once I recognized the role, past interactions rearranged themselves in my memory. The dismissals weren't random, they were corrective. Whenever I drifted too close to influence, the system gently pushed me back into position. Too confident? Concern appeared. Too assertive? Reframed as stress. Too certain? Labeled as misremembering. The family didn't need me to be wrong. They needed me to be less. And I complied because compliance kept things smooth. This wasn't about cruelty, it was about efficiency. Families, like organizations, optimize around roles that reduce friction. My role reduced friction beautifully. I was dependable. I didn't demand emotional labor. I didn't force accountability. And because I didn't disrupt anything, I was trusted in a limited, controlled way. The painful part wasn't realizing how I was seen. It was realizing how clearly that version of me served everyone else. If I challenged it, the cost wouldn't just be conflict, it would be inconvenient. So I stayed. But something subtle shifted once I understood the role. I stopped internalizing the dismissals. They weren't evaluations. They were maintenance. The system maintains itself. That realization stripped the interactions of their emotional weight. When my words were softened or redirected, I didn't feel hurt. I felt documented, as if I were watching a case study in real time. And with that distance came a new kind of patience. I began to notice when I was relied upon without being respected, when my labor was welcomed, but my perspective was not, when my silence was praised as maturity. I also noticed something else. No one asked me what I wanted. Not once did anyone say, "Eleanor, how do you see this?" in a room full of people. Not once did someone defer to my judgment publicly, even on matters I clearly handled privately. My authority was acceptable only in the shadows. That's when I understood the full shape of the role. I was safe as long as I remained invisible. And invisibility can feel peaceful, until you realize how easily it can be mistaken for absence. By then I wasn't angry. Anger would have been too loud. I was clear that if anything was going to change, it wouldn't be through protest. It wouldn't be through emotional appeals or explanations. It would require a shift that the system couldn't smooth over. But I wasn't ready yet. Understanding the role was only the first step. Deciding whether to leave it or use it was another matter entirely. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no dramatic exit, no moment anyone else would remember. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind you'd never mark on a calendar. I was sitting alone in my apartment, sorting through paperwork. Old files, tax documents, notes from work. The slim leather notebook I carried everywhere lay open beside me, filled with lists, reminders, fragments of conversations I'd written down over the years without any clear intention. At some point, I realized I wasn't organizing papers. I was organizing patterns. Dates lined up, statements repeated. Small discrepancies I'd brushed off years earlier suddenly looked deliberate, not malicious, but strategic. I could trace how certain stories about me evolved over time, how language softened or sharpened depending on who was present, how concern was deployed precisely when I approached autonomy. What startled me wasn't what I found. It was how calm I felt finding it. There was no rush of vindication, no surge of anger, just a quiet internal click, like a door closing behind me. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was being unfair. That question had kept me small for years. Am I reading into this? Am I being sensitive? Am I misremembering? I set it down. In its place, a different question appeared. What do I know for certain? I knew what had been said. I knew how often it had been repeated. I knew who benefited from it. And I knew something else, something I hadn't allowed myself to articulate before. The narrative about me wasn't accidental. It was useful. That realization didn't hurt. It clarified. I understood then that no amount of explaining myself would undo something that wasn't built on misunderstanding. The story didn't need correction, it needed exposure. But not yet. That afternoon, I made a decision no one else could see. I stopped trying to be understood by people who weren't listening. Instead, I committed to understanding the structure I was inside. I reviewed messages, emails, group chats. I noticed how often decisions were framed as consensus when they weren't, how my agreement was assumed rather than requested, how my silence was recorded as consent. And I noticed something else, something almost absurd in its simplicity. Everything was documented. Not officially, not in contracts or declarations, but in patterns of communication, in phrasing, in who spoke and who summarized afterward, in how concern was used as a shield against accountability. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt awake. That was the shift. From that day on, I stopped reacting emotionally, not because I was suppressing anything, but because emotion no longer served a purpose. Clarity did. I didn't confront my siblings. I didn't hint at change. I didn't withdraw. I stayed exactly the same on the surface. But internally, I began to reposition myself, not as a participant in the family narrative, but as an observer with agency. I started writing things down deliberately, dates, exact wording, context, not to build a case. I didn't yet know what the case would be, but to anchor myself in reality. Because the most destabilizing thing about being quietly discredited is not the disrespect. It's the doubt. And doubt evaporates when facts are allowed to stand without interpretation. That afternoon, sitting alone with my notebook, I reclaimed something I hadn't realized I'd given away: epistemic authority, the right to trust my own perception without seeking permission. Nothing changed outwardly. I still attended gatherings. I still listened more than I spoke. I still helped when asked. But the internal contract had been rewritten. I was no longer waiting for fairness. I was preparing for the truth. After that quiet afternoon, my silence changed quality. Before, it had been reactive, a way to avoid conflict, to preserve harmony, to keep myself from being mischaracterized further. Now it was deliberate, chosen, structured. I spoke less, but not because I had less to say. I spoke less because every word became a data point. I noticed how my siblings filled the space when I didn't, how quickly assumptions hardened when unchallenged, how confidently stories were told in my absence, and how little they changed when I was present. People mistake silence for emptiness. They assume nothing is happening behind it. That assumption worked in my favor. When plans were discussed, I listened. When decisions were announced, I nodded. When concern was expressed on my behalf, I thanked them. And quietly, I wrote things down, not with the intention of confrontation, that would have been premature, but with the intention of precision. Exact phrases, who said what, who echoed it later, how language shifted depending on the audience. I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was mapping terrain. The more I stayed calm, the more relaxed everyone else became. The role I played was comfortable for them, familiar, non-threatening. My continued compliance reassured them that nothing fundamental was changing. And because they felt safe, they became careless. Careless with wording, careless with consistency, careless with logic. At family gatherings, I noticed how often my siblings contradicted themselves within the same conversation, how concern morphed into authority without explanation, how my supposed fragility coexisted conveniently with my reliability. No one questioned it because no one had to. Except me. I began to test small boundaries, not by pushing, but by withholding. I stopped volunteering labor. I declined certain favors politely without explanation. I delayed responses. I became just slightly less available. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger an alarm, just enough to observe reactions. Concern intensified, speculation increased, narratives adjusted to accommodate my absence. She's probably overwhelmed. She's been distant lately. I hope she's okay. Still calm, still caring, still unexamined. I watched how quickly my lack of participation was pathologized, how my autonomy was interpreted as instability, how even neutrality was read through the existing story. That told me everything I needed to know. Because when every behavior is interpreted as evidence of the same conclusion, the conclusion isn't responsive to reality. It's protected. And protected beliefs don't collapse under denial. They collapse under exposure to their own contradictions. I understood then that if I ever spoke, truly spoke, it couldn't be emotionally. It couldn't be reactive. It would have to be surgical. Questions, not statements. Requests for clarification, not accusations. I practiced those questions privately. I imagined how they would sound out loud. Calm, curious, almost naive. And I waited. Others thought my silence meant resignation. That I'd accepted the role fully. That I'd retreated into myself. They were wrong. What they didn't see was the internal shift from endurance to authorship. I was no longer enduring the narrative. I was studying it, preparing to let it unravel itself. And the most powerful part? I didn't need anyone's permission to do that. Because lies don't survive scrutiny, they survive comfort. And I had become very good at letting others stay comfortable, right up until the moment they couldn't. There's a particular kind of freedom that comes when people stop watching you closely. Once my silence was interpreted as withdrawal, attention shifted away from me almost entirely. My siblings discussed plans without looping me in. They spoke about me more than to me. They assumed I was coping quietly somewhere in the background. That assumption created space. And in that space, I prepared. Not in a dramatic way. I wasn't building a case file or drafting speeches. I was doing something far less visible and far more effective. I was learning how systems record truth and how they reveal inconsistencies when asked to do so plainly. At work, I had already developed habits that translated easily. Documentation, timelines, cross-referencing, quiet verification. Skills that had always been framed as supportive suddenly became strategic. I began by organizing my notes properly. Dates, context, exact wording, who else was present, how the same story changed across different settings. I wasn't interpreting anything, I was transcribing reality as it occurred. Patterns emerged quickly. My supposed instability appeared only in social narratives, never in written communication. My confusion never showed up in emails, texts, or logistical follow-through. In fact, in writing, I was often the most precise person in the room. That mattered, because stories collapse when they can't survive contact with records. I also started educating myself, quietly. Not to confront, but to understand leverage that didn't rely on emotional appeal. Family dynamics intersect with practical realities more than people like to admit. Financial dependencies, shared responsibilities, assumptions about availability. I learned where I was indispensable and where I had been taken for granted. What surprised me most was how much of the family's smooth functioning relied on my unacknowledged labor. Scheduling, mediating, remembering, coordinating. All things I'd done instinctively for years without framing them as contributions. Once I stopped offering them automatically, the gaps became visible. But still no one noticed me. They noticed the inconvenience, and that distinction was important. I also noticed something else. The narrative about my mental state had never been tested. It was asserted, echoed, and accepted, but never examined. No one could point to a concrete incident that justified it. It existed as a general impression, not a claim with evidence. That made it fragile. Because general impressions don't withstand specificity. So I practiced specificity. In private, I rehearsed what it would sound like to ask for clarification. Not aggressively, not defensively, just patiently. What do you mean by that? Can you give an example? When did that happen? Simple questions. Questions that force vague claims to become concrete or collapse. I didn't intend to use them yet. I just needed to know I could. Positioning, I learned, isn't about power. It's about timing. And timing requires restraint. So I continued as before, outwardly, calm, cooperative, slightly distant. I attended gatherings. I smiled. I listened, and I watched how confidently others spoke in my presence, assuming I wouldn't respond. They were right. Not yet. What they never noticed was that their certainty depended on my silence, not my agreement. That their authority over the narrative existed only because no one asked them to explain it. And explanations are dangerous when they're built on repetition instead of fact. By the time Thanksgiving approached that year, I wasn't nervous. I wasn't angry. I was ready, not to expose anyone, but to let the structure speak for itself. Because when you've prepared properly, you don't need to raise your voice. You only need to ask the right question, once. The private reveal wasn't a discovery in the dramatic sense. It didn't arrive as a single document or a shocking realization. It was the quiet understanding of where the story about me could not survive scrutiny. And that understanding brought clarity, not triumph. I realized the leverage wasn't something I had to create. It already existed. It lived in the gap between what was said about me and what could be demonstrated if anyone bothered to ask how those conclusions were formed. My siblings spoke with confidence, but not precision. Their concern was emotional, not evidentiary. It relied on implication rather than example. That made it vulnerable. The leverage was simple. They could not explain their claims without contradicting themselves. They said I was unstable, yet relied on me consistently to manage logistics. They said I misremembered, yet corrected their own timelines using information I provided. They said I was fragile, yet trusted me in moments of crisis. Those contradictions had gone unnoticed because no one had ever lined them up side by side, including me. Once I did, the fog lifted. I didn't feel satisfaction, I felt responsibility. Because leverage of that kind isn't a weapon, it's a mirror. And mirrors don't attack, they reflect. I spent time thinking through the implications. What would happen if I asked for clarification publicly? Not emotionally, socially. What would shift? Who would be uncomfortable? Who would rush to soften things? Who would go silent? I wasn't imagining humiliation. I wasn't rehearsing speeches. I was considering consequences. Because once you expose a contradiction calmly, you can't unexpose it. You can't pretend it wasn't noticed. The room changes. Relationships recalibrate, even if no one acknowledges it out loud. That's irreversible. And irreversibility carries weight. I asked myself whether I wanted that change, whether I was willing to lose the ease of invisibility in exchange for clarity, whether I was prepared for the quiet discomfort that follows truth. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I waited for confirmation. Not from others, but from myself. And it came in an unexpected way. A few weeks before Thanksgiving, a family friend asked me gently if I was doing okay. The question wasn't hostile, it was sincere and rehearsed. Clearly, something had been said. I asked, just as gently, "What makes you ask?" They hesitated, smiled awkwardly. "Oh, your siblings just worry." That was it. No specifics, no incident, no explanation. Just worry. In that moment, the final piece fell into place. This wasn't about protection. It was about authority over interpretation. My siblings had become the narrators of my inner life, without my consent. And narrators don't like being questioned. I thanked the friend, changed the subject, went home. That night, I didn't write anything down. I didn't need to. The leverage was no longer theoretical, it was active. All that remained was deciding whether, and when, to use it. I didn't feel urgency. Thanksgiving was approaching, but I wasn't planning a confrontation. I wasn't even planning a statement. I was planning a question. One question, asked calmly, asked publicly, asked without accusation. A question that required an explanation, or revealed the absence of one. I understood then why I'd stayed silent for so long. Not out of fear, but out of instinctive timing. Something in me had known that speaking too early would only reinforce the narrative. Now speaking at all would change it, and that knowledge settled in me like still water. No celebration, no anticipation, just readiness. The decision wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where I sat upright and thought, this is it. It came the way most irreversible choices do. Quietly, after every alternative has already exhausted itself. By the time Thanksgiving week arrived, I had mapped every option available to me. I could continue as I had been. Stay quiet, stay useful, stay misunderstood. There was safety in that. Familiarity. A predictable discomfort I knew how to manage. I could confront my siblings privately. Ask them to stop. ask them to explain themselves behind closed doors. But I knew how that would end. Concern would sharpen. Apologies would be vague. Nothing would change publicly, which meant nothing would truly change at all. I could distance myself, attend fewer gatherings, let time blur the narrative. But absence would only harden the story. Silence without presence looks like confirmation. Every reversible option preserved the same outcome. Only one choice altered the structure itself, and that choice was irreversible. I decided I would speak once, in a way that could not be reframed later, not emotionally, not defensively, not as a rebuttal, as a request for explanation. Because statements invite counterstatements, but questions invite accountability. I didn't plan the exact wording until the morning of Thanksgiving. Not because I was nervous, but because I wanted the question to be responsive, not rehearsed. It needed to arise naturally, from something already said, so it couldn't be dismissed as an attack. The key wasn't what I would ask. It was how I would hold myself while asking it. Calm, neutral, et puis genuinely curious. No sarcasm, no edge, no emotional charge for anyone to latch onto. I reminded myself of something important. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to clarify. That distinction changed everything. When I arrived at the house that afternoon, nothing felt different on the surface. The same smells, the same voices, the same assumptions are quietly in place. My siblings greeted me with practiced warmth. Concern flickered briefly in their eyes. Not because of anything I'd done, but because that was now the lens through which they saw me. I smiled, hugged them, took off my coat. Inside, I felt steady. At the table, conversations overlapped. Stories were told. At some point, inevitably, my sister mentioned me in passing, not cruelly, almost casually. "She's been having a rough time lately," she said, smiling toward someone else. "But she's managing." There it was. The opening. I waited a beat, long enough that my response wouldn't feel reactive, short enough that it would feel natural. Then I turned to her and said calmly, "Can you help me understand what you mean by that?" The table quieted slightly, not fully, just enough. She blinked. "What do you mean?" I kept my voice even. "You've said a few times that I'm having a rough time. I'm just wondering, what specifically are you referring to?" It was a simple question. And suddenly, simplicity was dangerous. I wasn't accusing her of lying. I wasn't denying her concern. I was asking for clarification, the one thing the narrative had never required. She hesitated, laughed softly. "Oh, just everything." I nodded. "Can you give an example?" That was the moment. Not of conflict, but of exposure. Because there were only two paths forward: explain or retreat. And either one would change the room. I sat back slightly, waited. No tension in my posture, no defensiveness in my tone, just patience. Whatever happened next, there would be no undoing it. And I was ready to live with that. What happened next at the table was important, but not yet decisive. Because the truth is, the moment didn't end the story. It set it in motion. After my sister's hesitation, someone changed the subject. A dish was passed. A laugh broke the tension. The conversation recovered its rhythm, as conversations always do when people don't yet understand what's shifted. Outwardly, nothing collapsed. Inwardly, something irreversible had begun. I didn't press the issue that night. That was intentional. One question was enough. Any more would have felt like insistence, and insistence would have given them something to resist. Instead, I let the silence do the work. Over the next few weeks, I moved exactly as I always had. I showed up. I responded politely. I didn't reference the dinner or follow up on it. I didn't seek reassurance or clarification. That was the part no one noticed, because they were waiting for emotion. They were waiting for me to spiral, withdraw, over-explain, or apologize for making things awkward. They were waiting for proof that the old narrative still applied. None came, and in that absence, they grew uneasy. Behind the scenes, I made small practical adjustments. Nothing confrontational, nothing that required permission. I stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine to manage. I redirected responsibilities back to their owners. I answered questions with clarity, but without cushioning. I didn't announce boundaries. I enacted them. At the same time, I continued documenting, but now with a different purpose. Not to prepare for confrontation, but to ensure that if the story about me evolved again, it would have to account for consistency. And something subtle began to happen. People started asking me questions directly. not about my emotional state, about logistics, about decisions, about plans. The tone hadn't shifted fully, but the direction had. Because once you ask someone to explain a claim publicly, you plant a seed of doubt that doesn't need watering. Everyone at that table had witnessed the pause, the absence of an answer, the retreat into vagueness. They might not have analyzed it consciously, but they felt it, and felt things change behavior. My siblings didn't confront me about the question. They didn't mention it at all, but their language softened. Their certainty wavered. Concern was still present, but it became less declarative, more cautious. They were adjusting, carefully, quietly, just as I was. That's the thing about silence when it's chosen. It creates room for others to reveal themselves. When you stop explaining, people start listening more closely to their own words. And contradictions don't like being heard. Weeks passed, then months. No dramatic fallout, no apologies, no acknowledgement. But the old ease was gone. They were more careful when speaking about me, less confident, less fluent. And when someone asked, "Is Eleanor okay?" the answers became shorter, less rehearsed. "I think so. She seems fine. She's doing her thing." Not certainty, but neutrality. That was the beginning. Not punishment, not revenge, just recalibration. Because once a lie is questioned calmly, it can't regain its original confidence. It has to work harder. And working harder makes it visible. I hadn't changed my family. I had changed the conditions under which they could speak about me. And that, I learned, was enough. The consequences didn't announce themselves. They arrived indirectly, through confusion, misalignment, and a quiet sense of loss no one could quite name. At first, it showed up as friction. Plans took longer to organize. Messages went unanswered longer than usual. Details were missed. Small things slipped. Birthdays remembered late. Logistics misunderstood. Emotional landmines stepped on without anyone smoothing them over in advance. No one blamed me directly. They just noticed that things felt harder. My brother called one afternoon, clearly frustrated about a scheduling issue. He spoke faster than usual, irritation creeping into his voice. Halfway through the conversation, he paused. "You used to handle this stuff," he said, not accusingly, more puzzled. I let the silence stretch for a moment before answering. "I didn't realize it was mine to handle." He didn't respond right away. That pause, brief, awkward, told me everything. He wasn't angry, he was recalculating. Because loss feels different when you can't name what you've lost. My sister, too, seemed unsettled. She checked in more often, but without her usual confidence. Her questions were open-ended now, not diagnostic. "How are you feeling these days? What's been on your mind?" I answered honestly, but briefly. I didn't offer reassurance. I didn't invite interpretation. I gave her facts. "I'm busy. I'm doing well. I'm focused on work." She nodded, but I could see the discomfort behind her eyes. Facts didn't give her anything to work with. They didn't confirm the old story, but they didn't contradict it dramatically either. They simply existed. And existence without interpretation is destabilizing when you're used to controlling the narrative. Gradually, I noticed something else. My siblings began to over-explain themselves, just slightly, just enough to reveal uncertainty. They clarified jokes that didn't land, softened statements mid-sentence, corrected themselves unnecessarily. It wasn't guilt, it was awareness. They knew something had shifted, even if they didn't know how or why. The old assumptions no longer moved through the room unchallenged. They hesitated before speaking for me. And hesitation is expensive, because it forces people to think. The loss they felt wasn't my presence. I was still there. It wasn't my help. I still assisted when asked directly. The loss was unquestioned authority. They could no longer rely on the ease of explaining me away. They had to account for me as an autonomous adult, or risk exposure to their own inconsistency. That adjustment cost them comfort, and comfort, once gone, is deeply missed. There were moments when I almost stepped back into the old role, when it would have been easier to smooth things over, to take responsibility quietly, to absorb the discomfort for everyone else. But I didn't. Not out of spite, but out of respect for the truth. Because every time I resisted the urge to overfunction, I reaffirmed something essential. I was not responsible for maintaining a narrative that diminished me. Slowly, others began to notice too. A cousin asked me for advice directly, bypassing my siblings entirely. A family friend commented that I seemed grounded. Someone else said, "You always explain things clearly." Small statements, unremarkable on their own. But together, they told a new story, one that didn't need defending. My siblings felt that shift before they could articulate it. They sensed that something they once controlled had loosened its grip. And control, when lost quietly, creates a peculiar kind of anxiety. They weren't angry at me. They were unsettled by the absence of something they'd come to rely on. My silence as consent. And that loss once felt couldn't be undone. There's a moment when people realize a situation has changed. Not temporarily, but structurally. It doesn't come with drama. It arrives as a slow creeping awareness that the old strategies no longer work. That's where my siblings found themselves. At first, they tried to repair things the way they always had, through reassurance, casual check-ins, warm smiles, statements designed to smooth over whatever discomfort had appeared. But reassurance only works when the underlying assumptions are still intact. These weren't. My sister invited me out for coffee one afternoon. Her tone was light, but there was an urgency beneath it. She talked at length about stress, about how everyone worries too much, about how families sometimes miscommunicate. I listened. Then she said carefully, "If we've ever made you feel misunderstood, that was never our intention." It wasn't an apology. It was a revision attempt. I nodded. I know. That was all. She waited for more. For reassurance, for the emotional engagement, for absolution. None came. The silence stretched, not tense, just empty. And in that emptiness, her words hung there without resolution. My brother took a different approach. He became practical, offered help, asked if I needed support, framed it as teamwork. "Just tell me what you need," he said. I smiled. "I will." I didn't. Not because I didn't need anything, but because the offer came too late to restore the old balance. Asking for help would have placed me back in a position of dependency, and dependency was the foundation of the narrative they'd built. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to stabilize the system. But systems can't be stabilized once their assumptions are exposed. They also began to speak more carefully about me to others. But caution without clarity sounds like uncertainty. And uncertainty invites questions. When someone asked, "Is Eleanor okay?" My sister hesitated. My brother shrugged. "I think so," he said. "You'd have to ask her." That sentence mattered. For the first time, they were redirecting authority back to me. Not intentionally, but because they no longer felt comfortable speaking on my behalf. They had lost confidence in the story. And without confidence, the story couldn't function. I could see moments of regret flicker across their faces. Not regret for what they'd said, but regret for how easily it had unraveled. For how little it took to destabilize something they'd assumed was permanent. They hadn't anticipated that one calm question would be enough. And now there was no clean way to undo it. Because undoing it would require admitting that the narrative was unfounded. And admitting that would require acknowledging the harm, even if unintended. They weren't ready for that. So they hovered. Concern without authority. Care without control. Presence without direction. It was uncomfortable to watch, not satisfying. There was no sense of victory, just a quiet finality. I realized then that even if they apologized fully, it wouldn't restore what had been lost. Trust doesn't reset when understanding arrives late. And I didn't need restitution. I needed autonomy. The system had already recalibrated. People now looked to me for my own explanations. My words stood on their own without translation. Whatever my siblings were feeling, panic, regret, confusion, it was theirs to process. And for the first time, I didn't feel responsible for managing it. Because some changes aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be accepted. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't planned. It happened on an ordinary evening, weeks after everything had already shifted. No raised voices, no dramatic lead-up. Just 3 adults in a quiet room, sitting with a truth that could no longer be avoided. My sister spoke first. "I think we need to talk about what happened," she said carefully. "Things feel different." I nodded. "They are." That was all the invitation I gave. She took a breath. "We were just trying to help you. You know that, right?" I didn't disagree. I didn't validate it either. "I believe you thought you were helping," I said calmly. My brother shifted in his chair. "Then why does it feel like you're pulling away?" I met his eyes, not challengingly, just directly. "I stopped letting other people explain me," I said. Silence followed. Not the heavy kind, the thinking kind. My sister frowned slightly. "We weren't explaining to you. We were worried." I tilted my head. "Can you explain what you were worried about?" Same question, the same calm. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. You just seemed overwhelmed. With what is yeah, I asked. And she looked at my brother, then back at me. Life. I waited. The pause stretched. This time, there was no table to hide behind, no distractions, just the question and the absence of an answer. I don't remember asking either of you to manage my inner life, I said gently. Do you? My brother exhaled slowly. No. I also don't remember you asking me how I was before telling others. I continued. If I'm wrong, tell me when that happened. Neither of them spoke. I wasn't accusing, I wasn't angry, I wasn't even disappointed. I was precise. I'm not saying you're bad people, I said. I'm saying that a story about me existed, and I wasn't consulted in its creation. My sister's eyes filled slightly, not with tears, with recognition. We didn't think it would matter, she said quietly. I know, I replied. That's why it did. There was nothing else to say. No demands, no ultimatums, no dramatic reconciliation. Just understanding. Late, incomplete, but real. The conversation ended without resolution, and that was okay. Resolution implies return. I wasn't returning anywhere. I stood up, hugged them both, left. The absence of heat made it impossible to dismiss what had been said. There was no emotional mess to clean up, no overreaction to point to, just clarity. And clarity, once spoken aloud, doesn't need reinforcement. Who I am now isn't a reaction to what happened. It's the version of me that existed all along, finally unburdened by explanation. I didn't cut my family off. I didn't make grand declarations. I didn't rewrite history. I simply stopped negotiating my reality through other people's comfort. That change was quiet, but it was complete. These days, when I enter a room, I don't prepare to be misunderstood. I don't rehearse disclaimers or soften my language in advance. I speak plainly. If someone asks how I'm doing, I answer honestly and briefly. I've learned that clarity doesn't require elaboration. My siblings still care about me. I believe that. But the relationship has shifted. They no longer narrate to me. They no longer speak for me. When questions arise, they redirect them. You should ask Eleanor, they say now. That sentence carries more respect than any apology could have. The family system adjusted, slowly, unevenly. Some discomfort remains, but it's honest discomfort, not the smoothness of erasure. I'm no longer the emotional buffer. I'm not the quiet mediator. I don't absorb confusion, so others can feel at ease. And I don't feel guilty about that. What surprised me most was how much energy I gained once I stopped managing perceptions. The mental bandwidth that opened up felt almost indulgent. I became more present at work, more selective with my time, more grounded in my decisions. Not louder, not harder, just clearer. I don't feel the need to correct every misunderstanding now. That urge has disappeared. When you trust your own authority, you don't chase validation. People respond to that in subtle ways. Conversations are more direct. Boundaries are assumed instead of negotiated. Respect arrives not as praise, but as space. I used to think dominance looked like control, like asserting yourself until others back down. I know better now. Dominance, the quiet kind, looks like it does not need to be believed in order to be certain. It looks like asking one calm question and letting the absence of an answer do the work. It looks like refusing to perform fragility for the sake of harmony. There's no bitterness in me when I think back, just awareness. I understand why the story about me formed. I understand how easy it is to mistake concern for authority. I understand how systems protect themselves. And I understand that stepping out of a role doesn't require confrontation. It requires consistency. I didn't change who I was. I changed who had access to explain to me, and that made all the difference. There's a lesson in this story that took me a long time to understand, not because it's complicated, but because it's quiet. When people lie about you calmly, they don't need volume. They don't need cruelty. They only need repetition and your silence to translate it into consent. Most narratives that trap us aren't built through malice. They're built through convenience, through people speaking about us instead of with us, through concern that slowly turns into control. And the most painful part? We often help those narratives survive because challenging them feels riskier than living inside them. I used to think strength meant enduring misunderstanding with grace, that if I stayed calm long enough, the truth would eventually speak for itself. But the truth doesn't speak. It waits. It waits for someone to ask the question others have been avoiding. What changed everything wasn't exposure, confrontation, or revenge. It was a single calm request for explanation, asked in a space where vagueness could no longer hide. Lies fall apart when questioned calmly, not when attacked, not when shouted down, but when asked to explain themselves in plain language. That's the moral of this story. You don't need to convince anyone you're sane, capable, or worthy of respect. The moment you try, you've already accepted a frame that isn't yours. What you can do is stop providing emotional cover for stories that don't hold up under scrutiny. You can stop correcting, stop defending, stop over-explaining. And when the moment is right, not rushed, not reactive, you can ask one simple question and let silence do what arguments never could. That silence might feel uncomfortable at first. It might feel like a loss. But what you gain is something far more stable than approval. You gain authorship. If this story resonated with you, you're not alone. Many people live inside versions of themselves that were written by others, especially in families, workplaces, or relationships where harmony is valued more than honesty. So I'll leave you with one question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever realized that someone else was telling your story for you? And if so, what stopped you from asking them to explain it? Thank you for listening.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.